And welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur, talking about prostitution laws in Canada. They've changed over the years. You may have heard that there's a case dealing with this right before the Supreme Court of Canada. And, some argue that making prostitution legal would actually provide more safety for prostitutes. Others believe it would simply lead to more exploitation and hurt for those involved in the sex trade. So we're joined today by John Sikkema. He's the Director of Law and Policy with ARPA Canada, the Association for Reformed Political Action. ARPAcanada.ca is their website. Good to have you with us today, John.
Thank you, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah, maybe we could start with you giving us a bit of a background here. Again, we've had some changes to our prostitution laws, I think way back to the 1990s, something like that. And so maybe give us a bit of a backgrounder here.
Yeah, so a bit of a background on the law. The law that we used to have in place, so this is before 2014, actually goes back quite far. But that law prohibited basically keeping a brothel. It prohibited profiting off of someone's prostitution, which we just think of that stereotypically as pimping.
Right.
It also prohibited communicating in public for prostitution. And prostitution itself, though, was not illegal, right? And that's kind of a key part of this. So there was a challenge to those provisions around prostitution. Again, communicating in public, profiting from someone's prostitution, operating a brothel in the 1990s, and the court upheld that law in the early 90s. But that's basically the same case was brought later on, and in 2013 the Supreme Court of Canada struck down those same laws. And the court basically said, look, the law has not condemned prostitution per se. It's tried to treat it as a public nuisance and keep it out of public view. And what the court said is that basically makes a legal activity very dangerous to engage in, because women couldn't even, talk to a man, and it's almost always a man, in the street before getting in the car with him. So that increased their danger, but it did little, to stop to stop prostitution. It just made it dangerous. And so the court found that was unconstitutionally causing risks to their life and safety.
Yeah, and that makes sense, I think. Yeah, okay.
So that was considered kind of a major victory for those who were pro-liberalizing or legalizing prostitution. And that's effectively what that judgment did, because Canada's only prostitution laws were then struck down. But there was quite a reversal when Parliament then adopted really the strictest prostitution law that Canada's ever had, and prohibited prostitution itself. So purchasing sexual services is what the law now prohibits, and it also prohibits other things related to prostitution, like recruiting someone into prostitution, or harboring someone for the sake of prostitution, again, profiting off of someone's prostitution. These things are now illegal again, but in a whole new framework that says this law is not just about treating prostitution as a nuisance to keep at a public site. It's about treating prostitution as exploitation. Right? It's an exploitative industry. Every transaction, even if it's not coercive, involves commodifying human sexuality, which we believe is bad for people. It's bad for communities. It's bad for individuals. So the law takes now a new approach. And while it prohibits some of the same things, again, like profiting from someone else's prostitution, it's doing so in a new framework. And so far, we've been seeing courts. This is the first time it's gotten to the Supreme Court of Canada just this past month. But so far, we've seen the lower courts, the appeal courts, uphold this law.
Okay. So this case right now, then, I think it's called R versus Klubikov. So what are they challenging here? Because right, so what we have in place now, I think it's called like a Nordic model, right? So again, there's a level of protection there for prostitutes, but what exactly are they challenging here?
Yeah, so this was a criminal case that made its way to the Supreme Court, and the men, Mr. Klubikov is the case is named after, and Mr. Mustaine were drivers for a human trafficking operation, and it really was that these men would bring women from city to city, basically control what they had to do, take all the money that they made, and several of the men were convicted of human trafficking offenses, which are actually, they're very severe offenses. But these two men were, again, as drivers working for the men convicted of trafficking. They were driving women to basically to appointments with purchasers, and basically helping this commercial operation make money off of them. So these men went to court and were convicted of these offenses, but they challenged the law and said, by not allowing us to work as drivers and by not allowing prostituted women to have other security measures like working from a fixed indoor location, you are, again, like in the Bedford case, making it riskier for them to do this. And so these laws are unconstitutional and we can't be convicted of an offense that's unconstitutional. So that was the basic argument, but they actually went farther than that. They actually were so bold as to argue that the government has no business at all prohibiting prostitution per se. The government cannot prohibit someone from purchasing sex if it's consensual. And so they kind of challenged the entire Nordic model, even though they were only convicted under a couple of components of it that did not involve the purchasing offense directly, which is kind of the linchpin of the Nordic model.
Okay. So, and you with ARPA had intervener status, right? So you got to speak and voice some of these concerns, right, before the court. And how did that go?
That's right. So ARPA, together with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, so two Christian groups, intervened basically to explain to the court the significance of Parliament's finding that prostitution is inherently exploitative. So there was some attempt to argue that this is really a question of fact. The court can look at this situation and say, well, here prostitution is exploitative, but if we look at the evidence in this case, where let's say the woman was not coerced into it, it's not exploitative. So the reason the parties were arguing that is if it's not exploitative in this case, the law is overbroad, right? It goes too far if it's just trying to stop exploitation. And our intervention was focused on saying, no, it's not really a question of evidence. It's a question of, can Parliament say as a normative judgment that every exchange of sex for money commodifies human beings, is bad for society, undermines human dignity, and therefore ought to be prohibited? And we were saying yes, and that's where this law basically came from. And I think that was fairly well received. That the court, I appreciate that the majority of judges seem to be deferential to say, well, this is the kind of policy judgment surely the Parliament can make. Now, there's limits on that, and so there was a bit of an argument about, well, should any government prohibit someone from, choosing their sexual partner or engaging in consensual sexual activity? I think the court was a bit skeptical about whether that extends to prostitution. So sure, maybe the government shouldn't be in the business of telling you who you may or may not have a consensual sexual relationship with, especially in a society that generally accepts liberalism.
Right.
But to do that and get paid for it, or on the other side, to pay for sex, that's not something you have a constitutional right to do. No court has ever found that, and that would be kind of stretching our law of liberty too far. And I think, again, the court appreciated that. And so that gives me hope for a decent outcome in the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, who then, I guess, is intervening for the other side of the argument that you just explained you're arguing against, right? Who wants to see these kinds of changes where it's okay to pay for sex and our society is somehow better off with that? Who's intervening for that?
Yeah, so one group was the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, a feminist group. It's interesting that feminists are split on the issue. There was also the Vancouver Rape Relief Society on the other side of the issue, right? To say prostitution is dangerous and bad for women, and we should try to abolish it. So, but there was a sexual health coalition. There was a couple of constitutional rights foundations that, again, are kind of arguing for this, kind of broader liberty to engage in this kind of this activity as long as it's consensual, right? So, some more kind of traditional liberal constitutional groups that see anything that's consensual as something that people should be free to engage in. There's a couple of those groups as well, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the David Asper Center for Constitutional Freedoms. These are some other groups arguing basically against the validity of these laws.
Yeah, I mean, so the argument goes, right, that if it's a regulated environment and it's legalized, I mean, we all would agree that we want to see safety here. if people are going to engage in this kind of activity, want to keep the prostitutes safe, keep them alive, right? But how do you best go about doing that, and how does this affect the whole of society? So there's that argument that, hey, you know what, they're consenting adults, they're paying for this, and this would simply provide a safer environment. So how do you respond to those issues? Does it actually keep them safer? Yay, nay?
Yeah, that's really a question that was disputed on the evidence. The level of a lot of competing evidence, but a number of experts on this will just say it is always risky, right? So even the accused in this case, Mr. Klubikoff, Mr. Mustaine, introduced evidence from someone who paid for law school by prostitution, was in an escort agency, very different from street prostitution,
Yeah,
had supervised locations and things like that, so higher security. But even she admitted that she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted. So in any form, when you treat someone like a commodity,
yeah.
it seems like sexual assault and forms of violence, these things they're kind of inherent to it. It is an inherently problematic activity, and that's what this law is based on. So Parliament takes the view that the best way to protect people, to keep people safe, is not to legalize prostitution and regulate it and have again brothels with security present and that kind of thing. It's actually to have as little prostitution as possible. So not to protect people basically from prostitution is the policy approach that Parliament is taking, and suppress prostitution especially by suppressing demand for it, by telling men, who make up 99.4% of purchasers, that they can be punished for this, that they should not engage in it, and that purchasing sex is exploitative and damaging to society.
Yeah, as you say, it is inherently dangerous. I saw a stat here that showed the vast majority of victims in the sex trade-related offenses are women. Many very young. More than 40% of victims of violent offenses involving at least one sex trade-related offense are between 12 and 17 years of age. I'm thinking, really? Yeah, we don't want to see this sort of thing increasing in Canada, and those are some pretty hard numbers there. That's should get our attention for sure, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. The Quebec government did a study. I think they found that 80% of prostituted women start as minors. There's whole strategies 80%. For recruiting vulnerable women into this. I think a survey of women in prostitution found 81% wanted to exit, but only 1% wanted to remain. So there's kind of an in between there, not sure. But very few women who are in it, want to remain in it. Is the point? Most are in there due to unenviable circumstances.
Yeah. So if we allow prostitution to flourish, if you will, and to increase, again, we talked about the demand that's there, and there's not enough, I guess, supply for the demand. So that leads to more trafficking. Human trafficking of young girls. This is something that should greatly concern us. Now, let me ask you this: does Canada, properly prosecute these kinds of offenses? Prostitution-related crimes. Do we just kind of let them slide?
I think it's been in some ways improving as we've seen police forces get better. Some police forces have created prostitution and trafficking task forces to really focus on this. But I think it's fair to say, though, that the law has not been enforced as strongly as it could be. There are, for all the known instances of purchasing sex, very few of the buyers are prosecuted. And so I think this is something that a government, as a matter of policy, could say we're going to enforce this more. Also, the previous government had implemented a funding for helping women get out of prostitution. That was obviously a key part of the Nordic model. Is on one hand suppress demand, but on the other hand help people get out of it. And that funding was discontinued a few years ago by the federal government. So that's something that I hope in the future.
Yeah, I wonder what the reasoning is behind not continuing that particular approach. Put some money into helping people get off the street. That just makes sense, I think. Why would we pull that back? Was there any reasoning for that? Do we know?
I'm not sure. I know that the current government, at least in its platform, has been in favor of legalizing prostitution. I
Mm,
don't think they've had necessarily the political capital to make that happen, or
right.
want to make that an issue in Parliament, especially when it's being litigated. Right? There's been several cases that could basically do the job for the current federal government. If a court strikes down the existing law, that would be kind of a major step towards legalization. So I don't know if it
Hmm.
has to do with that they're generally not for the Nordic model. I can't say exactly, but
Right. But again, I think we would all agree, from whatever side we're coming from, we want to see human trafficking decreased as much as humanly possible. And so, why would we not invest money into that to get, prostitution reduced? Get the young gals out of there who want to get out of there, which is the vast majority of them, right? Invest some money into that. Just makes sense to me. Let me ask, I guess, do we have any stats, any recent polling surveys? How does the Canadian public view this? Do we want to see prostitution legalized in our country? Or are we happy with the current system that at least protects them, the Nordic model, the Nordic approach?
right. Yeah, there has been polling on this. I mean, the Canadian government did consultations on it, but there's also been independent polling that has found that Canadians generally do support our current model,
Okay.
which is very encouraging. It's also been interesting to see. I don't know if there's a comparable study in Canada, but in Sweden, they showed that the law actually helped to change public views. So before, Sweden was the first country to adopt what is now known as the Nordic model. But before they did so, a few years before they did so, I think it was about 70% of Swedes thought prostitution itself is okay, should be legal. And by the time that they had banned it, it was the other way. It was over 70% were thought that purchasing sex should be illegal. Again, in Canada, it looks like we have a fair bit of support for this law. I'm very encouraged by that. No doubt that's also why the government hasn't made it a priority. Even if they agree in principle
Hmm.
with legalization, they haven't made it a priority to do so. And I'm thankful for that. And I hope that this case will
Yeah.
survive this Supreme
Okay.
Court challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have heard in some nations they've tried. I think they call it a John school. So the Johns being the guys who go and pay for sex buy that from a prostitute, and then they actually have to sit down. I understand, and kind of look in the mirror and get some education on what all is involved in this. Okay, again, this is connected with human trafficking, real girls, underage girls in many cases, with a mom and a dad. Well, they may not have both mom and a dad at this point, but they're somebody's daughter, right? Real kids with hopes and dreams, and you're basically helping crush their lives because you want a few minutes of pleasure and you're willing to pay for it. Let's wake up, and they say it is actually fairly effective. So sometimes we just got to face the reality, and that makes sense to me to have that sort of a thing as a working deterrent.
Right. Yeah, and I think that kind of education too starts with police forces. We have seen some evidence in prostitution challenges in recent years that some police are saying we don't really bother with cases that don't seem exploitative, and by that they mean it doesn't look like
Hmm.
this is an underage woman, or it doesn't look like this
Right.
person was manipulated or coerced into it, and so it might not be a focus for enforcement. Certainly for the purchaser, they might look for a pimp or something like that. But yeah, so they this focus on, well, what it is or isn't exploitative for police to get that. Again, the objective of the law is generally suppressing prostitution, because everyone involved in prostitution is at risk. That would be helpful as well towards better implementing this policy. Um, yeah, I think it is the right way to go.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I noticed too, we often use kind of sanitized terms, if you will, for prostitution. We use terms like sex trade, or this one really gets me, empowering choice for women. Like, again, how many women would want to make a choice like that? I think generally speaking, I mean, it's rather rare to have somebody choosing to be quote unquote empowered to pursue, work like this, if you want to call it work. So I think that's part of what we as a society need to be aware of as well and say, hey, you know what? Let's call it what it is. I mean, you're basically paying to have sex with somebody. It's called prostitution. And I know it's been around forever, but it continues to wreck lives, right? I mean, what kind of society do we want, right? We need to ask ourselves that as fellow Canadians. We value freedom, yes, but do we want our children growing up in a country that promotes this kind of thing? That sex trade, is this some sort of career option? Are we going to be teaching this in our schools? And part of me says maybe we already are to some degree, in that we teach so much about, again, I guess our hypersexualized world that we live in, and teaching children that all these different sexual choices in life are kind of normalized. We're getting away from a lot of biblical principles here, common sense, I think, and then we wonder why, we have high rates of, sexually transmitted diseases and so forth. And does this tie in even with, it's okay to go and become a prostitute? Maybe I'm over exaggerating things. I don't know. But your thoughts on this?
No, I think again that you often hear, laws downstream from culture. There's some truth to that, but I think again that the law can be an important teacher, that the law can inform society about what we have kind of collectively deemed to be okay or not okay. And so in that way too, the fact that this law sends a clear message, that we as a nation are not okay with purchasing sex. That is just not another market activity. This involves something that, human bodies, human sexuality, not for sale, because
Yeah.
we see people as inherently having dignity, their sexuality as having meaning and significance. And I think that's important. I hope that that kind of informs the culture in a healthy way in the future.
Yeah, I sure hope so. So, what is happening in the nations, and I'm not sure how many nations there are now, where prostitution has been completely legalized. And again, I appreciate the idea that they want to keep prostitutes safe, but again, at what cost, right? So does human trafficking decrease in these nations? What's the
No,
result?
from the evidence that I've seen, it suggests that human trafficking very much increases. Again, like you hinted at this earlier, when you legalize prostitution, the demand for it goes up. Often in these countries, Netherlands is an example, you end up getting sex tourism. And so to meet that
Mm,
demand, there's not enough women, there's almost no women who just voluntarily want to do this, who are choosing this from um, other means of making a living. And so the to meet the demand, people end up getting trafficked into it. Again, with varying degrees of coercion, from manipulating someone with mental health issues to outright kidnapping and coercing someone. There's varieties of, or sorry, there's variations of how coercive it is. But again, to meet the demand, we see an increase in trafficking. There's lots of women who've been trafficked from other countries into the Netherlands to meet the demand that's there, and that's very troubling.
it is very troubling. Now, getting back to the Klubikov case here before the Supreme Court of Canada. So, I guess there's a couple of angles here. One, would they get rid of the Nordic model completely? That's one option. And then we're talking about, again, a couple of guys who are drivers, right? So it's possible, I guess, that the Supreme Court could, make some changes there. Would they say yes, it is okay to be okay if you're driving somebody and you're adding a level of safety, that's going to be okay, and you get paid for it, that's okay. I mean, how could they possibly rule on this thing?
Yeah, so I see that as the worst possible. Well, not the worst possible. The worst conceivable outcome is that the court will say, you know what, this law isn't clear enough on um, what forms of involvement are okay. So the law does say, for example, that you are allowed to drive someone, like you could drive a friend to go somewhere to sell sex. as long as you're not kind of in the business of doing so. If you're not working for a commercial entity that sells people's sex, you could work as a driver hired directly by a prostitute. Again, as long as you're charging fair market prices, you're not controlling that woman, and you're not part of this kind of trafficking operation that Klubakov and Mustaine were part of, that's okay. And so there's a lot of debate at the Supreme Court about, well, when does someone who's just a driver for the woman become a driver for a commercial entity? Or could two prostitutes working together hire a manager? When does a manager go from someone who's just helping them out to someone who is exploiting them? So this kind of third party involvement stuff, again, we know that purchasing always prohibited. What kinds of third party involvement is okay in some examples was a bit foggy to the court. So it's possible the court says this isn't clear enough and Parliament has to kind of go back to the drawing board. What I don't foresee happening in this case is the court saying the Nordic model as a whole is invalid, even though obviously Klubakov and Mustaine were arguing that it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's encouraging to hear that's not likely. Okay. All right. Just to wrap things up here, where do you see this whole prostitution law debate going over the next decade or so, and what can we do to help keep things, I guess, as clean and as safe as possible here?
Yeah, I think there's other cases that may make their way up to the Supreme Court that involve more direct challenges to this law. So I'm praying that the courts continue to make good decisions on this, as we I think so far have seen. Certainly praying for the Supreme Court in this case that I hope that they uphold the law, but in whatever they decide, that it wouldn't be getting in Parliament's way of continuing to have good public policy on this.
Got to leave it there for time's sake. Appreciate what you're doing there, John. John Sikkema with ARPA Canada, arpacanada.ca. Thank you for watching. Pray for these situations. Right, you can watch the podcast at WizeUp.ca. God bless.